In a small town nestled between green hills and winding roads lived a couple named Margaret and Thomas Whitaker. They had been married for over 60 years, longer than many people live. Their house was old but cozy, with wooden floors that creaked when you walked on them and a garden out back that Margaret had lovingly tended for decades. The neighbors loved them. Everyone knew who they were. You could often see them walking hand in hand down Main Street, or sitting together on the porch, sipping tea and watching the world go by. Thomas was a quiet man, kind and thoughtful. He had worked as a carpenter most of his life, building furniture and fixing things around town. People said he had steady hands and a calm voice that made you feel safe. Margaret was the opposite, warm, talkative, and always smiling. She volunteered at the local library and helped organize charity events. Her pies were famous in town, especially her apple crumble, which she made every Sunday without fail. Together they raised two children, a son named Daniel and a daughter named Sarah. Both had grown up, moved away, and started families of their own. But every holiday they came back home to visit. The house would fill with laughter, stories, and the smell of baking bread. Even as they aged, Margaret and Thomas kept their traditions alive. Every morning they went for a walk through the woods behind their house. Every Sunday they went to church. Every evening they sat together in the living room, reading or listening to soft music. To everyone who knew them, Margaret and Thomas seemed like the perfect example of love. Not the flashy kind you see in movies, but the real kind. The kind that grows slowly, deepens over time, and survives everything life throws at it. They had weathered storms together, illness, job loss, the pain of losing friends, and even the heartbreak of saying goodbye to family members. Through it all, they held each other's hands and kept going. But there was one thing no one knew, not even their children. Margaret carried a secret. It wasn't a small secret either. It was the kind of secret that changes lives. The kind that, if revealed, could shake the very foundation of everything she had built with Thomas. And yet, for over 60 years, she had kept it locked away inside her heart. She never spoke about her childhood. When people asked where she grew up, she would smile and say, "Oh, just a little place far away." If someone mentioned Europe or World War II, her face would grow quiet, and she'd change the subject. She avoided certain movies, certain books, anything that reminded her of the past. But sometimes, late at night, Thomas would hear her crying softly in bed. When he asked what was wrong, she would say she was just tired or that she had a bad dream. He believed her, because he trusted her completely. The truth was, Margaret wasn't always Margaret. She had another name once, a name from long ago, from a different country, from a life she tried so hard to forget. Back then, she was Marta Weiss. She had been born in Poland before the war, the youngest of 3 sisters. Her parents owned a small bakery, and life was simple and happy. She remembered the smell of fresh bread in the mornings, the sound of her mother singing while she cooked, and the way her older sister used to tease her for being too serious. But all of that changed when the war came. Marta was only 16 when the soldiers came to her town. One day her family was together, laughing and eating dinner. The next day, they were gone, taken, separated. She never saw her parents again. She survived by hiding, by pretending to be someone else, by running when she heard footsteps and staying silent when fear gripped her chest. After the war ended, she was alone. There was no one left, no home, no family. Just memories and pain, so she did the only thing she could do. She started over. She got on a ship to America with a new name, a borrowed identity, and a broken heart. She promised herself she would never look back. She wanted to build a new life, one filled with peace and love, and that's exactly what she did. She met Thomas at a community dance in Boston. He had a gentle smile and kind eyes, and he made her laugh for the first time in years. They fell in love quickly, got married quietly, and settled down in Vermont. Over time, she became Margaret, the woman who baked pies, who planted flowers, who held her husband's hand every morning during their walks. The past faded into shadows, and the present became her whole world. But secrets have a way of lingering. They hide in quiet moments, in unspoken words, in the corners of your mind. Sometimes, when she looked at old photos, or when she heard a song from long ago, or when someone asked about her childhood, the memories would sneak back in. She would feel that same cold fear in her chest, the same guilt for surviving when others didn't. Still, she never told anyone, not even Thomas. He thought he knew everything about her. He thought they had shared every part of their lives. But there was one part she had kept hidden, the part that hurt too much to share. And now, after 60 years of marriage, Margaret was getting older. Her body was slowing down, and her mind was starting to wander. She began forgetting small things, names, dates, the reason she walked into a room. At first it seemed normal. After all, everyone gets forgetful with age. But soon she started, talking about things that confused Thomas. She would call him by different names, ask questions about people he didn't know, and sometimes stare out the window like she was seeing something far away. One afternoon, while they sat on the porch, watching the sunset, she suddenly turned to him and whispered, "I should have told you the truth long ago." Thomas looked at her, surprised. "What truth?" he asked gently. Margaret smiled, but her eyes were sad. "Never mind," she said. "It doesn't matter anymore." But to Thomas it did matter. Her words stayed with him, like a seed planted in his mind. Something was wrong. Something was off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he felt it. Like a storm was coming, slow and silent. Little did he know, the secret Margaret had kept for over half a century was about to come to light. And when it did, it would change everything he thought he knew about the woman he had loved for 60 years. As the years passed, Margaret and Thomas continued living their quiet life in Vermont. Their morning walks became slower, their steps more careful. They still went to church every Sunday, but now they sat near the back so Margaret could rest her legs if they got tired. She still baked pies every week, though sometimes she forgot to add sugar or left the oven off by mistake. Thomas didn't mind. He loved watching her smile as she worked, even when things weren't perfect anymore. But something was changing. At first it was small things. Margaret forgetting where she put her glasses, or asking Thomas the same question twice in one conversation. She would walk into a room and forget why she was there. She'd call Thomas by his brother's name, even though his brother had passed away many years ago. Thomas thought it was just age. Everyone forgets things sometimes, right? Then came the strange moments. One day, while they were sitting together in the garden, Margaret suddenly looked at him with wide eyes and said, "You're not him. You're not my Thomas." Thomas laughed gently. "Of course I am," he said. "Who else would I be?" Margaret didn't laugh. She just stared at him for a moment, then shook her head like she was waking up from a dream. "Never mind," she whispered. "I must be getting old." Thomas smiled, but inside, something felt wrong. Another time, Margaret stood in front of the mirror in their bedroom brushing her hair. Suddenly, she started talking to herself. Or maybe to someone who wasn't there. "I'm sorry, Ella," she whispered. "I should have saved you." Thomas froze. He had never heard that name before. "Who's Ela?" he asked softly. Margaret turned to look at him confused. "Ela?" she repeated. Then she smiled. "Oh, no one. I think I'm just tired." Thomas didn't press her. But the next day, he found her writing something on a piece of paper. When he walked into the room, she quickly crumpled it and threw it away. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Nothing important," she said, avoiding his eyes. Thomas tried to let it go. Maybe it was just her memory acting strangely. After all, she was in her early 80s now. It was normal for people to get confused as they aged. Still, the changes kept coming. Sometimes, Margaret would sit quietly for hours, staring out the window like she was seeing something far away. Other times, she would start crying without saying, "Why?" One night, Thomas woke up to find her standing in the hallway, wearing only her nightgown, holding a photo album. "Margaret?" he asked gently. "What are you doing?" She looked at him, eyes wide and full of fear. "They're coming," she whispered. "We have to hide." Thomas stepped closer. "No one is coming, love. We're safe." Margaret blinked, then slowly nodded. "Right," she said. "Of course." She handed him the photo album and went back to bed. Thomas looked down at the open pages. Most of the photos were of their family. Daniel and Sarah as children, birthdays, holidays, trips to the lake. But one photo caught his eye. It was a picture of a young girl. Not Margaret, but someone who looked very similar. She was wearing old-fashioned clothes, and the background looked nothing like Vermont. There was no date, no writing on the back, just a face that seemed familiar yet unknown. Thomas felt a chill run through him. The next day, he asked Margaret about the photo. "Oh," she said, barely looking at it. "That's someone from long ago." "Who?" Thomas pressed. Margaret sighed. "Someone I used to know." Thomas waited for her to say more, but she didn't. She simply closed the album and walked away. Over the following weeks, Margaret's behavior became stranger. She began talking about people Thomas had never heard of. A woman named Anna, a man named Jakob, a little girl named Lena. Sometimes she called herself Marta instead of Margaret, then corrected herself as if she hadn't realized what she'd said. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Margaret turned to Thomas and said, "I should have told you the truth long ago." Thomas looked at her, heart pounding. "What truth?" he asked again. Margaret smiled sadly. "It doesn't matter now," she said. "Soon I won't remember any of it." Thomas didn't know what to say. He wanted to ask her more, to push her to explain, but he saw the pain in her eyes, so he stayed quiet. Later that night, after Margaret had gone to sleep, Thomas sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the photo of the unknown girl. His mind raced. Who was she? Why did Margaret seem to forget and remember things at the same time? And most importantly, what was this secret she kept trying to tell him? He decided to investigate. The next day, he went to the town library. He looked through old records, war archives, anything he could find about European refugees who had come to America after World War II. He spent hours reading stories of families torn apart, of people forced to change their names, of those who survived against all odds. And then he found it. A newspaper article from 1947. It talked about a missing girl named Marta Weiss, who had disappeared during the war. Her parents had owned a bakery in Poland. Her older sister had been taken to a concentration camp. Marta had vanished during the chaos, presumed dead. Thomas stared at the screen, heart pounding. Could it be? Was Margaret? Marta? His hands trembled as he printed the article and rushed home. When he got back, Margaret was in the garden, tending to her roses. He walked over to her, holding the paper tightly. "Is this you?" he asked, handing her the printout. Margaret looked at it, then at him. For a long time, she said nothing. Finally, she spoke. "Yes," she whispered. "That was me." Thomas felt like the world had stopped turning. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions. How had she survived? Why had she never told him? Had everything he knew about her been a lie? But before he could speak, Margaret turned away. "I'll tell you everything," she said softly. "But not today." And with that, she walked back toward the house, leaving Thomas standing alone in the garden, holding a piece of paper that changed everything. Thomas stood in the garden for a long time after Margaret went inside. His hands were still holding the printed newspaper article about Marta Weiss, a name he had never heard before today, yet somehow now felt like it was tied to his entire life. He looked at the photo again. The girl in the picture had dark hair and sad eyes. She looked younger than the Margaret he knew, but there was something familiar in her face. Something soft. Something strong. He folded the paper and walked slowly back to the house. Inside, Margaret was sitting on the couch, staring out the window. She didn't turn when he came in. It was like she already knew what he was thinking. Thomas sat beside her. "Can you tell me?" he asked gently. "Tell me who you really are." Margaret took a deep breath. Her voice was quiet, like she was afraid someone might hear. "I'm not from here," she began. "I wasn't born in America. I came here after the war. After everything was gone." Thomas nodded, urging her to go on. "My real name is Marta Weiss," she said. "I was born in Poland. My parents owned a small bakery in Warsaw. We lived a simple life. There were 3 of us. Me, my older sister Ela, and my brother Jacob. My father baked bread every morning, and the smell would fill our whole apartment. My mother sang while she cleaned. Her voice broke slightly and she paused. Thomas reached for her hand. He held it tightly. "What happened?" he asked. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, like she was trying to remember, or maybe trying to forget. "The war came," she said softly, "and with it, everything changed." She told him how soldiers came to their neighborhood one day, how people started disappearing, how families were torn apart, how they tried to hide, how her parents were taken first. Then her brother. "I never saw them again," she whispered. Tears filled her eyes, but she kept going. "My sister and I ran away," she continued. "We moved from place to place, hiding in barns, forests, sometimes even under houses. We pretended we were someone else. I changed my name to survive. I became Margaret when I came to America." Thomas listened in silence. His heart hurt. For her. He couldn't imagine what she had been through. "But why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked. Margaret looked at him, sadness in her eyes. "Because I wanted to forget," she said. "Because I wanted to live a normal life. Because I loved you, and I didn't want this pain to touch you." Thomas swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say. That night after Margaret went to bed, Thomas couldn't sleep. He went to the attic and looked through old boxes, hoping to find more clues. Most of the boxes were full of photos, letters, and keepsakes from their life together. But in the back corner, behind an old suitcase, he found something strange. It was a small shoebox, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. He opened it carefully. Inside were old documents, some in Polish, some in German. There was a passport with a different name. Marta Weiss. There was also a letter, yellowed with age, written in shaky handwriting. Thomas read it slowly. "Dear Marta, if you are reading this, I hope you are safe. I don't know if I will survive, but I want you to know that I love you. You must keep going. You must live. Tell the world what happened to us. Promise me you won't forget. With all my love, Jacob." Thomas felt tears sting his eyes. Jacob was her brother, and he had died during the war. He put the letter back and looked at the other items in the box. There was a small silver necklace with a broken chain, a child's drawing of a family standing in front of a bakery, a black and white photo of a young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He turned the photo over. On the back, it said, Jakob, 1939. Thomas sat back on his heels, overwhelmed. The next morning, he brought the box downstairs. Margaret was already up, sipping tea by the window. "I found these," he said, placing the box on the table. She looked at it for a long time before opening it. When she did, her hands shook. "These are mine," she whispered. Thomas sat beside her. "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready," he said. "But I want to know. I want to understand your life." Margaret looked at him, surprised. "You're not angry?" Thomas shook his head. "No, I'm just—" Shocked, sad, but not angry. Margaret smiled faintly. Thank you. Over the next few days she began to share more. She told him about her sister Ela, who had been taken to a concentration camp and never returned. She told him about Jakob, who had stayed with her until the end, promising to protect her. She told him about the cold nights she spent hiding, the hunger, the fear, the guilt she carried for surviving when so many others hadn't. Thomas listened to every word. He learned that Margaret, or Marta, had come to America as a refugee. She had no family, no money, and no home. She had worked hard to build a new life, piece by piece. That was why she valued peace so much, why she loved gardening and baking and walking with him in the mornings. Those things reminded her of the life she had lost and gave her hope for the future. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas asked her something that had been on his mind. "Do you wish you had told me sooner?" Margaret thought for a moment. "I used to think I could leave the past behind," she said. "I wanted to give you a wife who was whole, not broken. I didn't want you to see me as someone who had suffered so much." Thomas reached for her hand. "You've always been whole to me," he said. "Even now, even knowing everything, I still love you. I always will." Margaret smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I'm glad," she said, "because I don't want to hide anymore." From that day forward, their relationship changed. Not in a bad way, but in a deeper way. They talked more, laughed more, shared memories, both happy and sad. Margaret began showing Thomas more photos, telling him stories about her childhood, about the bakery, about the people she had loved and lost. Thomas, in turn, promised to help her honor her past. "I want to make sure your story isn't forgotten," he said one day. "Your real story." Margaret nodded, grateful. But even as she shared more, her memory continued to fade. Some days she remembered everything clearly. Other days she forgot where she was or who Thomas was. The disease was getting worse. And soon another change would come, one that would test everything Thomas had just learned. But for now, they held each other close, grateful for the time they had left. And somewhere in the back of Thomas's mind, one question still lingered. What else was hidden in that old shoebox? Thomas sat alone in the kitchen one morning, a cup of tea cooling beside him. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Outside, birds chirped like nothing had changed. But inside, everything felt different. He looked at the shoebox again. It still sat on the table, half open, full of secrets that had been hidden for over 60 years. The passport, the letter from Jakob, the photo of Marta Weiss, all proof that the woman he had loved his whole life had once lived another life entirely. And yet, she had never told him. Thomas wasn't angry. He wasn't even hurt, in the way you expect when someone keeps something huge from you. But he felt lost, like the ground beneath his feet had shifted ever so slightly, making everything feel just a little unstable. How could he have spent 6 decades with someone and not know who she really was? He tried to imagine what it must have been like for her, to survive something so terrible, to lose everyone she loved, to start over in a new country with a new name and a new identity, to carry that pain alone, to build a life from nothing, but always look over your shoulder, afraid the past might catch up. No wonder she had kept it to herself. Margaret had told him she didn't want to bring darkness into their marriage. She didn't want him to see her as broken or sad. She wanted to give him a wife who could love, laugh, and live fully. Not someone haunted by ghosts. But now, knowing the truth, Thomas saw her differently. Not worse, not less, just more. She wasn't just Margaret, the sweet baker who made apple crumble every Sunday and held his hand during their morning walks. She was also Marta, the brave girl who survived war, loss, and fear, the girl who had buried her family and carried their memory in silence, The woman who had built a new life not out of choice, but out of necessity. The weight of her secret was heavy, and now Thomas shared that weight. He started thinking back, over their life together. All the times she had seemed distant, all the moments she had forgotten names or places, all the nights she had cried without explanation. Now he understood. She hadn't been hiding from him. She had been protecting them, both. One afternoon he went through the box again, carefully studying each item. The passport, the letters, the photos. He found another piece of paper tucked between two old envelopes. It was a list of names, people who had died during the war. At the top, someone had written, "In memory of those we lost." Among the names were Ella Weiss and Jakob Weiss. His heart ached. Later that day, he found Margaret sitting in the garden, watching the roses bloom. She looked peaceful, but her eyes were tired. "Did you ever think," Thomas asked gently, "that maybe telling me would have helped?" Margaret turned to him slowly. "I used to think that," she admitted. "But then I'd remember how hard it was just to get through the day. How sometimes just waking up felt like too much. I didn't want to pull you into my sadness." Thomas sat beside her. "You wouldn't have pulled me in," he said. "I would have held you." Margaret smiled sadly. "Maybe, maybe not." Thomas took her hand. "I wish I could have known your sister. I wish I could have met your brother. I wish I could have seen your parents' bakery." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "So do I." For a while, they just sat there, holding hands and watching the wind move through the trees. Over the next few weeks, Margaret's mind continued to slip. Some days she remembered everything clearly and would tell Thomas stories about her childhood, how her mother sang while she cooked, how her father taught her to bake bread, how her brother used to tease her about being too serious. Other days, she forgot where she was. She would call Thomas by the wrong name, ask questions about people he didn't know, and stare blankly at the walls like she was seeing things he couldn't. One evening, after one of those bad days, Thomas sat with her in the living room. She was quiet, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the fire. "I'm sorry," she whispered suddenly. "For what?" Thomas asked. "For not telling you sooner." Thomas reached for her hand. "You don't have to apologize," he said. "You did what you had to do." Margaret nodded, but her eyes were full of sorrow. Thomas leaned closer. "Tell me something," he said. "If you could go back, would you change anything?" Margaret thought for a long time before answering. "No," she said finally. "Because if I had done things differently, I might not have ended up with you." Thomas smiled, though his eyes were wet. "Then I'm glad you stayed." They sat together in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly in the background. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He got up and went to the attic again. He brought down a notebook and began writing. He wrote down everything Margaret had told him about her parents, her siblings, the bakery, the war, the escape, the journey to America. He wrote about the life she had left behind and the life she had built with him. He didn't want her story to be forgotten. He didn't want Marta to be forgotten. When Margaret woke up the next morning, she found Thomas at the kitchen table, still writing. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm writing your story," he said. "So it won't disappear." Margaret came over and read what he had written. Then she hugged him tightly. "You're a good man," she whispered. Thomas smiled. "You're a better woman." From that day on, they talked more than they ever had. They laughed, they cried, they remembered. Margaret no longer hid her memories. She let them come and go as they pleased. Sometimes she cried for hours, remembering her family. Other times she smiled, recalling small details, the smell of fresh bread in the morning, the sound of her mother's voice, the warmth of her brother's hand in hers. Thomas listened to every word. He learned that Margaret hadn't just survived the war. She had lived after it. She had chosen joy again and again, even when it was hard, even when it hurt. And now, as her body grew weaker and her mind wandered more often, Thomas made a promise to himself. He would finish her story. He would make sure the world knew who she was, not just Margaret, the kind baker from Vermont, but also Marta, the brave girl from Poland who had lost everything, only to find love and peace in a quiet town far away. A girl who had survived. A woman who had lived. As the months passed, Margaret grew weaker. The disease had taken hold of her mind and body, and though she still had moments of clarity, they became fewer and farther between. Some days, she remembered everything clearly: her childhood in Poland, her escape from war, her life with Thomas, their children, their home. On those days, she would smile, laugh softly, and even hum old songs from long ago. Other days, she forgot where she was. She would look at Thomas with confusion in her eyes, asking questions like, "Who are you?" or "Where is Ela?" Thomas never got angry. He never felt hurt. He simply took her hand, looked into her eyes, and said gently, "I'm Thomas, your husband, and I'm right here." On those hard days, he reminded her who she was. He told her stories about their life together, how they met, how they fell in love, how they built a home and raised two beautiful children. He showed her photos, played soft music, and read her favorite poems. And slowly, sometimes, her memories would return. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch swing, Margaret turned to him and said, "You've been so good to me." Thomas smiled. "Because I love you." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. "I used to think I didn't deserve happiness," she whispered. "After everything I lost, after surviving when others didn't, I thought I should suffer, too." Thomas held her hand tightly. "But you didn't," he said. "You chose joy. You gave me a life full of it." Margaret smiled, tears in her eyes. "Then I did something right." As winter came, Margaret's health began to fail quickly. She stopped going for morning walks. She no longer baked pies. Some days she could barely get out of bed. Her children visited often, bringing their own kids with them. They sat with her, held her hands, and told her how much she meant to them. Even though she didn't always remember their names, she knew their love. In her final weeks, Margaret and Thomas talked more than they had in years. They shared secrets, dreams, fears, and hopes. She told him again about her family, her mother's warm hugs, her father's kind eyes, her sister's laughter, her brother's gentle voice. "I miss them every day," she said one evening. Thomas wiped a tear from his cheek. "I know," he said, "but you're not alone anymore." Margaret reached for his hand. "No," she said softly. "I've never been alone." She looked out the window, watching the snow fall gently outside. Then she turned back to Thomas. "Promise me something," she said. "Anything," he replied. "When I'm gone. Don't forget me." Thomas's heart broke, but he forced a smile. "How could I forget you?" he asked. "You were my whole life." Margaret closed her eyes and smiled. Good. The next few days were quiet. Margaret slept more, spoke less, and spent most of her time holding Thomas's hand. One night, just before sunrise, she woke up suddenly. Her eyes were clear, her voice strong. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" Thomas asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "For loving me," she said. "For giving me peace. For letting me live." Thomas kissed her forehead. "Always." She smiled one last time, then closed her eyes. And quietly, peacefully, she was gone. A life remembered. Thomas was heartbroken. He had known this. Day would come, but nothing could prepare him for the silence that filled the house after Margaret passed away. The garden was still there. The porch swing was still there. Their photo albums, her baking pans, her favorite scarf, all still there. But she wasn't. The funeral was small, attended by family, friends, and neighbors who had loved her. People spoke about her kindness, her warmth, her apple crumble, and the way she made everyone feel welcome. Thomas stood silently listening, smiling through his tears. Later that night, he sat alone in their bedroom, holding the shoebox that had started it all, the box that held Margaret's secret past. He opened it once more and looked at the passport, the letter from Jakob, the photo of Martha Weiss. Then he closed it gently and placed it on the shelf beside their wedding photo. The next morning, Thomas called his son Daniel. "I want to do something with her story," he said. Daniel listened carefully as Thomas explained everything. How Margaret had once been Martha, how she had survived the horrors of war, how she had hidden her past for over 60 years, and how, in the end, she had shared it all with him. She wanted to be remembered, Thomas said, not just as Margaret, the baker from Vermont, but also as Martha, the girl who lived through hell and still found love. Daniel nodded. "What do you want to do?" Thomas thought for a moment. "I want to give these documents to a Holocaust museum," he said, "so people can learn about her, so they can remember her." Together, they contacted a memorial center in Washington, D.C. The staff was deeply moved by Margaret's story and accepted the items into their collection. They promised to display them with care and respect. At the ceremony where the items were donated, Thomas stood in front of a crowd and spoke. "This is the story of a woman named Martha Weiss," he began. "She was born in Poland before World War II. She lost her parents, her siblings, and nearly her own life during the war, but she survived. She came to America, changed her name, and built a new life. She married me, raised 2 wonderful children, and lived a life full of love and peace." He paused, wiping a tear from his eye. "But she never forgot where she came from," he continued. "And now we honor her memory. Not just as Margaret, the woman I loved, but as Martha, the brave girl who refused to be forgotten." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. A new beginning. Life went on. Thomas stayed in their home, surrounded by memories and love. He kept tending the garden, even though Margaret was no longer there to help. He baked pies on Sundays, though they never tasted quite the same. Sometimes he would sit on the porch swing and talk to the wind, as if Margaret could hear him. "I miss you," he'd say, "and I hope you know, I never stopped loving you." Years passed. Thomas aged gracefully, always carrying Margaret's memory with him. He wrote a book about her life, The Woman Who Lived Twice. It became a bestseller, touching the hearts of readers around the world. Schools used it to teach young people about the Holocaust. Museums displayed her photo alongside other survivors' stories. And somewhere, in a quiet town in Vermont, a garden bloomed year after year, filled with roses just like the ones Margaret used to grow. A lifetime of love, a secret carried for decades. A truth finally spoken, and a legacy that would never fade.